The world often feels like it's just locked in this state of perpetual argument,
Hmm.
whether it's political polarization or, those spats you see on social media or even just disagreements with your own family. The noise level it's just deafening.
It is.
And the division feels so persistent, it can make you feel, frankly, like being rational
Yeah.
is just futile.
That's a huge challenge of the modern age, isn't it?
Yeah.
We are just awash in these terrible arguments, and it seems like people prioritize speed and emotional punch over, well, over truth.
Right. You see these simple, really dramatic statements that just go viral, and they
Yeah.
don't care how much nuance they're just obliterating.
Exactly. So the question isn't just, is logic dead? It's more like, are we just doomed to shout past each other forever in our own little echo chambers?
And the simple answer here is that we desperately need logic now, probably more than ever, but, and this is the key, we need to use it well. Our source material for this deep dive, which is drawn really extensively from the work of the pure mathematician Eugenia Cheng, offers a kind of radical way to look at all this chaos.
Mhm.
She argues that logic isn't just a tool for math problems. It's a life belt for modern life.
Right, but only if we understand its structure, and this is crucial, how it interacts with messy human emotion.
Exactly. When most people hear the word mathematics, their mind just instantly goes to their least favorite class.
Oh, yeah. Algebra, calculations,
Yeah.
just numbers and formulas.
And this widespread myth is that math is only about calculating, I don't know, the trajectory of a rocket or solving for X.
But true, higher level pure mathematics is fundamentally about something so much broader.
Okay, so let's just unpack that myth right away. If it's not just about numbers, what is the core mission of advanced math?
It's a successful framework for justification. It's the art of building these rigorously logical arguments and then successfully convincing other experts that those arguments are sound.
So the utility is in the structure, not the arithmetic.
Precisely. It provides this shared framework that is so successful that, and this is remarkable, in mathematics, people actually agree on conclusions regularly.
That is the polar opposite of almost every argument we see today. So
Yeah.
we're not using this framework to solve for pi or the hypotenuse.
Right.
We're using it to learn how to think clearly about complex systems, about social dynamics, about how our beliefs are even formed in the first place.
And that is our mission for this deep dive. We are taking the techniques that were honed in mathematics and applying them directly to real-world arguments. We're going to learn how to use abstraction to cut through all the noise and find the essence of a situation.
And understand the structure of arguments, the direction they flow in.
Yeah, and maybe most importantly, pinpoint precisely where disagreements are actually coming from so we can stop arguing about all the surface-level stuff.
Okay, so let's start at the foundation, the goal of logic. We aren't aiming for some kind of rigid, cold correctness. The main goal of applying logic, as the source puts it, is to illuminate, to just shed light on a difficult situation.
And that's the boundary right there.
Yeah.
If you push logic too far past that point of elimination, you risk just falling into pedantry.
Okay.
But to get that elimination, you need two really disciplined concepts, abstraction and precision. We have to be meticulous about how we define things and how we reduce complexity.
So let's start with abstraction. It gets used as if it means simplification all the time, but the source material draws this really critical line between the two.
A vital line for clear thinking. Abstraction is the temporary tactical act of forgetting irrelevant details to reveal the essence.
So it's illuminating because it helps us see common structures.
Yeah. Think about the skeletal example. On the surface, humans are just infinitely diverse, right? Different genders, races, sizes, clothes, cultures. But if we abstract all those surface details away, what's left?
The underlying skeletal structure.
The skeleton, which is common to almost all humans. That commonality, that's the essence that abstraction reveals.
It's like finding the lowest common denominator of truth.
It is. And lets us generalize successful solutions. So if a surgeon learns how to fix a femur, that knowledge abstracts across pretty much all humans because the structure is the same. It's constructive.
Now let's contrast that with simplification. If abstraction is about revealing the essence.
Then simplification is about forgetting the critical details.
Ah.
Simplification is when you remove too much context. You take away the very details that make the logical structure applicable to the real world.
And that leads directly to those, fabricated black and white situations we see everywhere.
Exactly. Reality is infinitely nuanced, but simplistic logic tries to just shove it into two neat little boxes. If you reduce an incredibly complex political dilemma down to X is evil and Y is good, You've simplified away all the critical details, the history, the economics, the unintended consequences. And your logical structure is now just. It's fundamentally flawed. It's useless.
Okay, that really clarifies the goal. We need to be rigorously abstract, but not carelessly simplistic. Which brings us to the second foundation: precision versus pedantry.
Precision is that careful clarification you need to move forward. It's making sure that when you use a word, everyone in the discussion has the same definition. It sheds light because it gets rid of ambiguity.
And pedantry is just precision that's gone too far.
It's gone further than necessary to shed that light.
Yeah.
It's over-applying rigor when ambiguity wasn't really the problem to begin with.
And the line between them is subjective, I imagine.
Totally subjective, which is why it's so tricky in real life.
Yeah.
You know, your tolerance for ambiguity determines whether you see my rigorous definition as helpful or just an annoying delay.
So it depends on the stakes.
It all depends on the stakes. The required precision level changes completely.
The source materials analogies here are just fantastic. Let's talk about baking a cake.
Right. So if you're making a basic pound cake, you have a pretty high tolerance for ambiguity. If your sugar measurement is off by, say, 10 or 20 grams, the cake will probably still be edible.
But if you're making delicate macarons...
Now the stakes are higher. They rely on these delicate chemical reactions, so you need precision down to the gram. The precision tolerance is much, much lower.
And then the stakes can go up again dramatically, like in the medical field.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the anecdote from the source. A mathematician is about to get general anesthesia, and the anesthetist just cheerfully says to them, "Oh, I'm terrible at maths."
That is absolutely terrifying.
Because the precision required in that moment is literally life or death. Calculating drug doses is where exactitude is completely non-negotiable. It just drives home that the precision you need is entirely context-dependent. Math tells us how to be precise, but our human judgment has to tell us when.
And one reason this whole discipline is so hard for us as adults is just our reliance on language. We operate with this enormous tolerance for figurative speech, for metaphor, for ambiguity.
We take shortcuts all the time. If I say I'm feeling blue, you don't think I'm physically turning cyan, right? You know it's a shorthand for sadness.
Of course.
But formal logic requires us to temporarily set aside that kind of linguistic relaxation and to seek absolute clarity.
That story about the child and the crisps,
Yeah.
that illustrates this perfectly. The parent tells the child, you can just leave them on the table.
And the child takes it literally. If
Yeah.
they're operating on this very low ambiguity logic, and they tip the entire bag of crisps out directly onto the table surface.
Because them meant the crisps, not the bag.
Exactly. The parent meant leave them in the bag on the table. But the child was applying this rigid, literal interpretation. This contrast just shows that we only learn to be linguistically ambiguous and figurative because we realize context usually handles the confusion for us.
But when you start trying to build rigorous arguments...
That linguistic sloppiness has to be abandoned. We need the rigor of mathematical language to overcome the fuzziness of our everyday human language.
Okay, so once we have these precise terms, we need to understand how ideas connect. And that leads us to the fundamental flow of logic, the implication. A implies B.
If A, then B. This simple structure is the core engine of justification. It tells us that the truth flows in one direction.
And arrow notation is important.
Very important, because it stops the grammar of English from confusing us. Whether you say B, if A, or A causes B, or B follows from A, the logical flow is always A implies B.
Okay, so let's use a clear example. Let A be the engine runs out of gas, and B be the car stops moving.
Perfect. If A is true, the engine runs out of gas, then B must be true. The car stops.
Okay.
And that introduces the concepts of necessary and sufficient conditions.
Right, so A is the sufficient condition for B.
Correct. The event running out of gas is enough. It is sufficient to guarantee the car stops. You don't need anything else. You don't need a flat tire or a broken axle. A guarantees B.
And B is the necessary condition for A.
So B must be true for A to be true. If the car is still moving, so B is false, we know with 100% certainty that the engine did not run out of gas. A has to be false.
Stopping is necessary.
It is necessary for that gas running out assumption to even be possible.
That clarity is so important because now we get to what you called the single most common logical error in the real world.
The converse error.
This is where we mistakenly assume that if A implies B, then B must also imply A. We just flip the arrow.
And that flip is logically invalid. Just because running out of gas is sufficient to stop the car, it doesn't mean that the only way the car could stop is by running out of gas.
A dead battery, a flat tire.
Hitting a wall,
Yeah.
All of those are also sufficient conditions for the car stopping. So if the car stops, you can't definitively conclude it was out of gas. That is, inside that big circle B, there's a smaller circle, A, that's running out of gas. Because A is entirely contained within B, A implies B. But look at all that space in the big circle B that's outside of the little circle A.
That's where the dead batteries and flat tires live.
Exactly. B can be true even when A is false. The implication is fundamentally asymmetrical.
The source points out how misleading diagrams can even reinforce this error. Like if you draw two overlapping circles for U.S. citizens and legal U.S. residents.
Yeah, if they overlap symmetrically, it visually implies there are some U.S. citizens who can't legally reside in the U.S., which is just false. The relationship has to be drawn as one circle entirely inside the other to show the asymmetry accurately.
And this confusion often comes from our own conversational language, like when parents make conditional promises, the broccoli and ice cream bribe.
The classic bribe. The first statement is, if you eat your broccoli, you can have ice cream.
A implies B broccoli is sufficient.
Kid does A, they get B. Simple. But the savvy parent quickly realizes the child might try to get the ice cream without the broccoli. So they adjust the logic to close the loophole.
Right.
They switch to, you can eat ice cream only if you eat broccoli.
Only if changes everything.
It turns the implication around. It
Yeah.
means if you're eating ice cream, then we know you must have eaten your broccoli first. Now it's B implies A, broccoli is now necessary.
The most precise condition would be if and only if, right? You can have ice cream if and only if you eat your broccoli.
That's the logical ideal. A, if and only if B. It's perfect equivalence.
But no one talks like that.
It sounds so pedantic in daily conversation.
Mm.
So we end up living in this vague space where we just sort of assumed if means if and only if. And that sloppy assumption is what fuels all our converse errors.
Let's apply this to the common advice we give students. You must work hard to do well.
Okay, so working hard is usually presented as a necessary condition for doing well. If you do well, we assume you must have worked hard. So doing well implies worked hard.
Right. The converse error happens when the student flips this. They assume that because they worked hard, they are guaranteed to do well.
They mistakenly treat hard work as sufficient, but it's not. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You might also need to be studying the right material or using effective techniques, or maybe the exam was just unfair.
And if you think it's sufficient, and then you work hard and you still fail,
That's when the logic leads to despair or anger. Understanding that logical asymmetry helps you temper your expectations and, redirect your effort.
and the most potent example of this logical structure being just completely overridden by emotion, as the source cites, is the debate around the Affordable Care Act, the ACA.
Oh, this is a perfect demonstration of logical equivalence. A, if and only if B. The ACA is legally and logically the exact same thing as Obamacare. Supporting one means you support the other. They are interchangeable.
But depending on how you frame it, people will take completely contradictory positions.
Absolutely. Someone might strongly support the ACA's policies, but at the same time strongly object to the name Obamacare.
Just because of the emotional or political objections to the person it's named after?
And this is called false inequivalence. Two things are logically and factually equivalent, but because of presentation, marketing, emotion, they're treated as if they are fundamentally different political positions.
It's a striking example of how fragile logic can be.
It is. The way information is packaged can completely dictate whether you accept or reject a logical truth.
So how do you fight that? If logic doesn't hold up against clever emotional framing, what good is it?
You fight it by being hyper-aware that the presentation matters. The solution isn't to abandon logic, but to trace that emotional response back to where it came from. If someone says they hate Obamacare but love the ACA, you can use logic to point out the equivalence, but you also have to acknowledge the non-logical part, the emotion, to understand their resistance.
So the argument isn't really about the policy details at all.
Not at all. It's about personal or political association. And you can't win that with logic alone.
Okay, so arguments get even more complex when we build them using logical connectives like and, or.
Exponentially more complex. And before we can even get to causation, we have to clarify the ambiguity in those simple words. And is usually straightforward.
A and B both have to be true.
Right. But or is where the trouble starts because of the linguistic difference between inclusive and exclusive.
In pure logic, or is the inclusive or. A or B or both.
So if the airline says you pay a fee if your luggage is too heavy or too big, you pay the fee if it's too heavy, or if it's too big, or if it's both. The or includes the possibility of both being true.
But socially, we often use the exclusive or, A or B, but not both.
The classic example, the restaurant menu. Would you like tea or coffee? The implication is you choose one, not both.
And if you don't clarify which or you're using,
Your model of the system is going to be flawed. Ambiguity is the enemy of logical analysis.
now, connecting this to the real world, we almost always find these complex outcomes that result from multiple factors connected by and this takes us to the problem of singular blame.
Human psychology has this powerful drive to simplify causation. We want to point the finger at one person or one factor and just declare that's the reason.
But in a world run by complexity, outcomes rarely have a single cause.
Right. Let's go back to the example of the failed student. The negative outcome. Failing the exam resulted from two things. The student didn't work hard enough, and D, the teacher didn't teach well enough.
So both parts of that and statement were true.
And that led to the failure. So logically, how do you prevent that failure? Well, the negation of A and B is not A or not B.
Meaning, if either the student had worked harder or the teacher had taught better,
The failure would have been averted. Only one variable needs to change the outcome. But that mathematical fact doesn't mean the other contributing factor is innocent.
so if the teacher blames the student entirely, saying if the student had only worked harder, they would have passed.
They're engaging in sloppy single blame logic. They're ignoring their own contribution to the AND equation. And if the student blames the teacher entirely, they're ignoring their own lack of effort. Placing blame on just one side simplifies the system, and it absolves the other party of any responsibility.
And the source provides a really tragic, real-world example of this: the swatting incident. A hoax caller sends police to an innocent person's house, and that person ends up being shot and killed by the police.
A terrible case. And if the official report focuses only on the malicious intent of the hoax caller, claiming they were the singular cause of death, that is logically incomplete.
Because the death was caused by the hoax call and the police response.
Exactly. It was the combination. The hoax call and the disproportionate police response that involved lethal force with very little evidence. If the police had followed a different procedure or used less force, the man would be alive. The outcome was hoax call and police action. To ignore the police action, which is the final mechanism of death, is a failure to acknowledge systemic causality.
So we have to shift our perspective from discrete events to interconnected systems.
We must. We have to view results as products of a causal web, not some simple linear chain. The detailed causal diagram of that United flight incident, where the passenger was dragged off the plane, is a stunning illustration of this.
Right, that diagram forces you to look way beyond just the moment the security officer applied force. It starts with the airline systems.
Yes, overbooking, crew scheduling issues. The injury wasn't just caused by that guy resisting. It was caused by flight overbooked and crew scheduling problems and low volunteer offers and the airline's decision to single someone out and D them, calling security and D security using force.
So many steps in that chain were necessary.
Any one of them could have changed. If the airline hadn't overbooked, or if they'd offered more money, or if security had used different protocols, the injury wouldn't have happened.
So when someone dismisses all that complexity by saying, it really is that simple, he should have obeyed the rules.
That is just intellectually dishonest. It's the linguistic precursor to sloppy logic.
And this applies to personal issues too, like weight gain.
Absolutely. The source uses a diagram to show how factors like genetics, sleep, social pressure, time, money, emotions, they're all interconnected, and they often create these vicious cycles where an issue just feeds back into itself.
So for instance, stress might cause emotional eating, which leads to weight gain, which then causes more stress about health.
And that reinforces the initial trigger. When you look at that messy diagram, trying to assign blame, it's the poor diet, it becomes completely futile. The system caused the outcome.
So the logical takeaway isn't about assigning blame.
No, it's about identifying intervention points within the system.
So if blaming one single factor is logically futile in these complex systems, what is the constructive question we should be asking instead?
Instead of asking who is to blame for this failure, the intelligent, rational question is who will take responsibility for changing it? Since the outcome is a result of an and situation where multiple factors combine, any single factor, if you change it, can prevent the negative outcome. You don't have to fix the whole system, but you have to take responsibility for the part you can actually influence.
That shift from individual blame to systemic intervention, it really requires us to focus on the connections between things, not just the things themselves.
It does. And this brings us into the realm of something called category theory.
Now, that sounds highly technical. Why is a branch of mathematics that prioritizes relationships relevant to solving messy social arguments?
Well, category theory is a powerful abstraction because it fundamentally shifts the focus of mathematics. Instead of defining objects like numbers or sets by what they are, it defines them by the relationships and interactions, the arrows between them.
So it ignores what things are and focuses on what they do to each other.
Exactly. It's the ultimate framework for abstraction.
So if we go back to that emotional eating cycle, I feel bad implies I overeat, which implies I feel bad. How does focusing on the arrows help us break that cycle?
Well, the cycle has two implications, two arrows. There's the action arrow, which is feel bad to overeat, and the feedback arrow, overeat to feel bad. To break the cycle, you only need to interrupt one of those relationships.
So you can try to control the action or control the feedback.
Right. You can try to control the action. When you feel bad, you distract yourself instead of eating. Or you can try to control the feedback. If you do overeat, you deliberately refuse to feel bad about it, and that prevents the stress that restarts the whole cycle. Category theory encourages you to look for these relationship intervention points.
And we can use this relational structure to map hierarchies in the real world. This is where we get to the privilege cube.
Right. This is where the abstraction gets really powerful and, yeah, a little controversial.
So how does it work?
The mathematician starts with the abstract structure of the factors of a number, like 30 or 42. They're related by the divisibility relationship. This structure is a hierarchy, often visualized as a cube, and it's ordered by the number of prime factors a number has.
And so she applies this abstract structure to map three forms of privilege: rich, white, and male.
Yes. And this privilege cube is ordered by the number of privileges someone possesses, not the subjective amount of benefit they get from them.
And that structure provides clarity.
It does. At the absolute top, you have rich, white male, 3 privileges.
Yeah.
Below that, 3 groups with 2 privileges each: rich, white, non-male, rich, non-white male, and poor, white male. And at the very bottom, poor, non-white, non-male, 0 privileges. The arrows show the direct loss of one type of privilege.
I can see how this abstraction forces clarity. So what does this diagram immediately reveal about the common arguments against, say, the existence of white privilege?
It reveals the failure of the straw man argument, the claim that if white privilege exists, then all white people must be better off than all non-white people.
The diagram immediately proves that's false.
Right. It shows that a rich non-white male is structurally higher up the hierarchy than a poor white non-male. Being rich is a powerful advantage that can mitigate other disadvantages.
So the existence of a poor white person doesn't logically negate the concept of white privilege.
Correct. The logical implication of the cube is that if you hold all other circumstances identical, money, education, job, then the white person is expected to have better outcomes. It's a statement about the expected impact of a single variable when you isolate it.
So the abstraction forces the argument away from just anecdotal comparisons.
Exactly. Away from my white neighbor is poorer than me and toward a discussion of structural expected value.
That's a great example. Now, if we follow logic backwards through any argument, we eventually hit a point that can't be justified by logic alone. These are the fundamental starting points, or axioms.
And understanding your own axioms is probably the single most important tool for dealing with disagreement. Logic can only show you how to get from A to B. If two people apply perfect, impeccable logic, but start from 2 different axioms, 2 different definitions of A, they will logically reach different contradictory conclusions.
So the argument is no longer about logic.
No, it's about the non-negotiable starting point.
The author provides this really profound self-reflection, revealing one of her core non-negotiable axioms: caring more about avoiding false negatives than avoiding false positives. Let's break those terms down.
Okay. A false negative is when someone who needs help or deserves a benefit doesn't get it. Think of it as missing something important. A cancer screening fails to detect cancer that's really there.
Okay. And a false positive is the opposite.
It's when someone who doesn't need help or isn't worthy of the benefit still gets it. A cancer screening detects cancer that isn't actually there, leading to unnecessary treatment.
And the author's axiom is clear. She would rather risk a false positive than commit a false negative.
And what's fascinating is how she connects this one single axiom to seemingly unrelated policy issues right across the board.
It creates a logical coherence.
It really does. If she prioritizes avoiding false negatives, she will logically support expanding social services, even if it means some people who don't strictly need them might benefit the false positives. To her, the risk of leaving someone genuinely in need is unacceptable.
And this extends into areas like affirmative action or even criminal justice.
Yes. For cancer screening, she prefers the risk of unnecessary treatment over leaving cancer undiagnosed. We're talking about sexual harassment accusations. She argues we must be more concerned with widespread misconduct going unstopped. That's the false negative risk to society than the risk of a potentially false accusation, which is the false positive risk to the accused.
It's all logically derived from that single foundational axiom.
And she even used this axiom to shift her own stance on compulsory voting. Initially, she was against it, on principle, believing that democracy meant the right to vote, not the obligation to vote.
But then she realized the core issue wasn't about forcing someone to vote.
No, that's a false positive risk. She realized the core issue was voter suppression,
Yeah.
the false negative of people being unable to vote because of logistical barriers.
I see.
And compulsory voting forces the state to make it possible for everyone to vote. Once she framed the problem, not as forcing unwilling people to participate, but as removing barriers for disenfranchised people, her axiom dictated her support. She prioritized avoiding the false negative of suppression.
Even if it meant risking the false positive of unwilling participation.
Exactly, and that's the power of tracing a belief all the way back to its root axiom.
Okay, so we've established that logic works beautifully in these closed mathematical systems, but life is continuous. It's a sliding scale of shades of gray. And when we apply logic carelessly to these continuous gray areas, we often force ourselves into these absurd, extreme black and white positions.
That's because logic demands boundaries, but nature just resists arbitrary lines. The humorous example of the milk's best before date is a classic illustration of this.
Right, the line is drawn arbitrarily at midnight.
But the milk doesn't suddenly curdle at 12:00.01 a.m. Yet, the logical system forces us to treat the milk as perfectly fine at 11:59 p.m. and then unusable 1 minute later. It highlights the absurdity of applying rigid binary logic to a continuous process of decay.
And this leads to the conceptual problem of incremental logic, or what the source material calls the cake paradox.
The existential terror of the cake paradox.
Yes.
It uses mathematical induction in reverse to show how small logical steps can lead to a completely absurd conclusion.
So, premise one, eating one small piece of cake is fine. That seems reasonable.
Seems fine. Premise 2, the inductive step. If eating n pieces of cake is fine, then eating just one more n plus 1 is also fine because the difference between n and n plus 1 is negligible.
If both of those premises are true, the rigorous logical conclusion is that eating infinite cake is fine.
Which we know is absurd.
So one of the premises has to be wrong.
And the human solution isn't usually to draw an arbitrary line, like 4 cookies is the absolute maximum, because that line feels illogical. The human solution is often to draw the line arbitrarily far back. I will just avoid the first piece of cake altogether.
You create a buffer zone around the gray area.
Exactly. And this strategy of drawing the line far back has profound applications for personal safety in establishing boundaries, especially against manipulation or harassment.
Because behavior often exists on a continuous scale. A handshake is fine, physical assault is not. The gray area is in between.
A hand on the shoulder, a touch on the back. And manipulative people exploit that gradual incremental logic of the cake paradox. They assume that if n is acceptable, n plus 1 will also be acceptable, and they just push the boundary a little bit each time.
So the logical response for self-protection is to identify the zone that is definitely unsafe, and then draw your line far away from it.
Create that buffer zone of safety. If you wait until you are definitively unsafe to enforce the boundary, you're already in a crisis. Drawing the line where you definitely feel safe, even if it feels, ungenerous to the outside world, is a strategy for rational self-protection against that psychological incrementalism.
But logic isn't completely useless when we're facing this kind of ambiguity. There are mathematical tools for it.
There are. The first one is called fuzzy logic. Standard logic is binary. True, which is 1, or false, which is 0. Fuzzy logic allows for truth values in between 0 and 1. An object can be 0.8 true or 0.2 false.
So how does that help us in real life, beyond the rice cooker analogy?
It allows machines and systems to make subtle judgments based on subjective conditions. Think about self-driving cars. The car's speed isn't just fast or slow. It can be moderately fast. Fuzzy logic lets the car adjust its speed based on ambiguous data, like the rain is quite heavy or the traffic is somewhat dense.
So it avoids forcing a black and white decision where nuance is required.
Exactly. It leads to smoother, more sophisticated control than binary logic ever could.
That makes a lot of sense. And the second tool is the intermediate value theorem. How does that apply to the ambiguity of preference, like finding the perfect cookie size?
Well, the intermediate value theorem applies to continuous functions. If you create a range of options, say a continuous spectrum of cookies, from one that is definitely too small to one that is definitely too big, the theorem guarantees that your individual perfect preference must exist somewhere within that continuous range.
You might not know exactly where it is, but you know it exists.
And the practical takeaway for a non-mathematician is this. When you're dealing with a gray area that's continuous, like setting a fair price or finding a compromise, just knowing that a solution exists somewhere between the two extremes is empowering. You don't abandon the problem just because the answer isn't binary. You just need a better method to find it.
Okay, so we've used logic to organize our thoughts, but we have to acknowledge its ultimate limitations. Perfect logic, when it's set up incorrectly, can lead to contradictions. These are paradoxes.
Paradoxes are incredibly useful because they illuminate two things. Either there's a flaw in our logical setup or there's a flaw in our intuition about the world. They force us to examine the foundational rules.
The classic example is the liar paradox. I am lying.
Right. If the statement is true, it means it's false, and if it's false, it means it's true. It creates this infinite debilitating loop.
And this self-reference issue led to one of the biggest crises in mathematics, didn't it? Russell's paradox.
It did. It was so destabilizing that mathematicians had to essentially restructure logic into separate levels or types to prevent these self-referential loops from happening.
And this mathematical solution has a really profound application in one of the most contentious social dilemmas, the paradox of tolerance. If we're committed to being a completely tolerant society, must we tolerate intolerance itself?
It's the same problem. If you tolerate intolerance, you are allowing the very thing that will eventually destroy the environment of tolerance. You end up in a self-referential logical collapse.
So the solution is the same as the one for Russell's paradox.
You have to narrow the scope of the principle. You can't tolerate everything. You have to set a boundary. For example, you are tolerant of all things except those that directly involve harming other people or actively promoting the destruction of the tolerant system itself. You stop the loop by drawing a firm line.
Beyond paradoxes, logic also fails when circumstances constrain us, specifically when time or information is insufficient.
In an emergency, logic is just too slow. If you're in a burning building, your immediate life-saving action, I must get out, is instinctive.
Right.
Now, we can describe that action logically afterward, but you don't have time to process A and B in the heat of the moment. Intuition has to take over.
And then there are complex systems, like economics or weather forecasting, where the sheer volume of information just defeats logic.
Theoretically, these systems are deterministic. If you knew the precise position and momentum of every single air molecule, you could predict the weather perfectly. But in reality, the number of interacting variables is so fast, and the measurement errors compound so quickly, that long-term prediction is practically impossible. That's chaos theory.
Logic requires complete information, and when that's unobtainable,
Its limits are immediately reached.
this brings us to the failure of logic when cooperation is required, which is perfectly exemplified by the cornerstone of game theory, the prisoner's dilemma.
Yes. This scenario just exposes the gap between logical individual self-interest and beneficial collective outcomes. So you have two prisoners, Alex and Sam, interrogated separately.
And they have three possible outcomes.
Right. One, they both stay quiet, cooperate. They both get 1 year in prison. Two, one betrays and the other stays quiet. The betrayer walks free. The other gets 10 years. Three, they both betray each other and they both get 5 years.
So logically, for the individual, betrayal is the dominant strategy. Why is that?
Because regardless of what the other person does, the betrayer benefits most. If Sam stays quiet, Alex benefits by betraying. He goes free instead of getting 1 year. If Sam betrays, Alex still benefits by betraying. He gets 5 years instead of 10. So the logical, self-interested conclusion for Alex is always defect.
And since Sam is also a perfectly logical agent, Sam reaches the same conclusion. They both defect and they both get 5 years.
And that's the paradox. If they had just trusted each other and cooperated, which is the illogical choice from a purely self-interested view, they would have only gotten 1 year each. The dilemma shows why cooperation is so hard among perfectly rational, self-interested agents. It requires trust, a leap of faith that pure rationality can't provide.
And this dilemma applies perfectly to global cooperation, doesn't it? Like climate change agreements.
It's the exact same structure. The best outcome for the collective is universal cooperation. Everyone cuts emissions. But the logical, dominant strategy for any single nation is to defect, don't cut emissions, because they get the economic benefits of not cutting while free-riding on everyone else's clean air.
And that's why those international agreements always struggle.
Logic incentivizes betrayal, even though it leads to the second worst outcome for everyone, collectively.
Finally, let's just circle back to emotional language, which is so often used deliberately to override logical equivalence.
The American Airlines boarding example is masterful. By changing priority groups to groups 1 to 4 and labeling normal boarding group 5, the airline didn't actually change the boarding order at all. Logically, the process was identical.
But people felt demoted.
They felt demoted from a normal status to group 5, which led to real distress. They were upset about the word priority and the emotional connotation of the number, not the physical act of boarding.
And we saw this with ACA versus Obamacare. It's manipulation, using emotional connotation to guide your thought process away from the logical equivalence of the actual policy.
And this highlights that critical distinction between truth and illumination. Not everything that is factually true is helpful or relevant to the conversation. If you were discussing a dog walking app, the fact that they eat dogs in China might be true, but it does nothing to illuminate the actual discussion. It's just a distraction disguised as a fact.
Conversely, a political slogan might be slightly inaccurate, not strictly true, but it might be highly illuminating because it simplifies a complex reality enough to have an impact.
Exactly. Slogans often prioritize impact over rigorous truth, and we have to be aware of that trade-off.
So we've covered abstraction, implication, systemic causation, and the ultimate limits of logic. If pure logic is so fragile, especially when it's faced with chaos and emotion, the goal can't just be to be logical.
No, it has to be intelligently rational.
And what does that mean?
Intelligent rationality is about finding the right tools for the right problem. It involves using disciplined abstraction to find the core principle, knowing when to package complex systems into single, understandable units, and using pivots between different levels of abstraction to build bridges, especially when you're dealing with fundamental disagreements.
And we established that two perfectly logical people can disagree violently if they just start with different fundamental axioms, different non-negotiable starting points.
And the key to successful resolution is to trace the argument back to that root axiom. Once you isolate that non-logical, emotional, or value-based starting point, you can stop fighting about the surface conclusion.
And start building a bridge.
And start building a bridge by finding a sense in which the opposing positions are just different points on the same continuous gray area rather than black and white enemies.
The ultimate purpose of powerful rationality, then, is connection and collaboration for mutual benefit. We have to move away from the zero-sum mindset where, for one person to win, another has to lose.
We aim for that quadrant of mutual benefit where we help ourselves and others at the same time. Powerful rationality is the framework that lets us pursue that goal. It helps us identify systems that allow for collective improvement and avoid the pitfalls of, being a bandit or a martyr.
So we can move forward together rather than just devolving into isolated arguments.
Exactly.
That is a profound and, I think, a much-needed framework for navigating all the noise. We noted that logical certainty is only possible in these closed mathematical systems, and that one person's precision is often another's pedantry.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to consider. Knowing that logic often requires us to draw these arbitrary lines in continuous gray areas, what decision or boundary are you currently treating as a non-negotiable black and white fact in your life that might actually be a precise but entirely arbitrary line you have rationally but ultimately unilaterally drawn in a vast gray area?